Getting ready for this year's Selichos, returning to Hashem and saying that we wish to continue this project together, despite the ups and downs. And as a person should, I always try to listen to my wife. My wife said that I should speak about some of the time that we spent in America, specifically 2 years ago when I wasn't able to be here in remote. Every year we've been zocheh to daven Selichos together. And 2 years ago and 3 years ago, those two experiences were because of our great sins. We were exiled from the land. We weren't able to be here. And I was receiving treatment. So one thing that comes to mind all the time about that particular experience, which who knew that it would be so apropos, and that so many years later we'd still be experiencing some modicum of the same heartbreak of not really knowing what's up and what's down with these masks and with all of these different aspects of attempting to live in a world that is so unclear. So immediately after I had a bone marrow transplant from a donor, a few days after, I was in the hospital. My immune system was at zero. I had a white blood cell count of 0. And like this. I had a white blood cell count of 0. And my daughter, Noah, who is now 9, but at the time was several years younger, came to visit me in the hospital. And I was hooked up to an IV machine. I had other machines that were attached to me. And I asked the nurses, my daughter's coming to see me in the hospital.
Ellie, come get your teak from me.
I didn't want her to be afraid. I didn't want her to be scared. So I asked the nurses if they would please detach me if it would be dangerous in any way. And they obviously wouldn't do it. But if it wouldn't be dangerous, if there's a way to detach me from the IV machines, detach any of the scary devices that were making sure and monitoring my health. And if I could take off my hospital gown and just wear regular clothing. And they were okay with it. Okay, the nurses gave the okay. And I tag teamed with my wife that when she would bring up my daughter, she would call, we're on our way up the elevator. And I was able to come out like that. Now, there's one last thing this is before Corona, before the world got used to seeing people in masks. There's one more thing that was kind of tugging at me. It was that my daughter would come up and she would come out of the elevator and I would walk towards her and I would be wearing this funny mask. She was little. It was not the way that I'm looking out here right now where everyone wears a mask, and that was something that even kids are not frightened by. So I decided, without really asking anybody, that I was going to just keep the mask in my hand. And then once I saw her from a distance, I would say, look at this funny mask that the doctors gave Abba to protect himself, But once she was able to see my face and be able to put the mask on, it was like a whole different thing. And I always think back to that experience because it's not just that experience with me and my daughter, but in some peculiar way, I always come back to that feeling that when we come to this night, or we come to other ma'amadim, we come to these other experiences where we're coming to face Hashem, and maybe Hashem himself is not scary, but maybe there are certain things about the way that Hashem runs his world with din v'cheshbon, certain aspects which are maybe putting us in an uncomfortable state. Hashem always, what I want to talk about for the few minutes that we have before Selichos, Hashem always, before we come face to face with Hashem, when he's wearing all those masks, the masks of I'm not good enough, the masks of feeling disappointed in ourselves, we stand in the or of Hashem's light. Before we come to the place of the dinim, before we come to the place of feeling uncomfortable with ourselves, there is this profound feeling that we catch a glimpse of Hashem without the mask. We catch a glimpse of Hashem willing to forgive, smiling, explaining, the only reason I'm wearing this mask is in some way to protect. There's some protection that's going on here, whether it's in the case of a father to a daughter in a hospital setting where it's the father protecting himself, or whether he's wearing the mask because he's also in a certain case sometimes. Hashem gives us a glimpse of that, flashes us a smile before putting the one of the Gemaras that describes this, we don't really have in Chazal any source for Selichos. It's not really on the books so much, it's a minhag Yisrael. The Gemara talks about this Indian of Dovid'l Midos Harachamim, which sits at the epicenter of the Selichos experience. But the Dovid'l Midos Harachamim, this recipe that we have to attach to Hashem's forgiveness, that is mentioned in the Gemara in a certain sense, where the Gemara says that it would be heretical to say such a thing if not for the fact that the Gemara itself seems to indicate this based on some psukim. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kiviyachol, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when he was teaching Moshe Rabbeinu the Yud Gimel Sarachim, Pasuk says, we'll say it so many times over the next little bit, that Vayavor Hashem al panav vayikra, Hashem passed over his face. And in the simple interpretation of the pasuk, the way that we always read it our whole lives, is that Moshe Rabbeinu was in some cleft in the rock. Moshe Rabbeinu was hiding, and Hashem passed over Moshe Rabbeinu's face. But the Gemara explains that it's not only that Hashem passed over Moshe's face, and says the Gemara would be couldn't even utter such words other than the fact that the Torah seems to indicate this, that Kadosh Baruch Hu Ki'ilu himself passed over his own face. The reference to the fact that Hashem donned a white talus, like a white talus. Hashem donned this white talus and passed it over his own face like a chazan does, as he taught Moshe Rabbeinu the Yud Gimel Midos Harachim. We spoke a little bit about Friday night. And the Marsha over there, in that Gemara, explains that exactly as I said a moment ago, in the same way that when I went to see my daughter when I was sick in the hospital, first I wanted her to see my face, and then I covered myself with a mask so as not to frighten her. So the Marsha explains that this white talus that Hashem passed over his face, Marsha writes, I saw in an old book of the Mekubalim, Kach state in the Marsha, I saw in an old book of the Mekubalim that this white talus, Kiviyachol, that Hashem was Kiviyachol wearing, is the same white talus that Hashem was wearing when he created the world. The Gemara says that prior to the creation of the world, one of the 7 things that Hashem created before creating the world is Hashem created this koach of tshuva. Hashem created the possibility that a person can return. There's the possibility of a person making amends. And so that same talus that Hashem wore, Kiviyachol, when he was creating the world, he put on again to show Moshe Rabbeinu that even though I'm about to cover myself in this talus, and even though the entire experience of Din V'Cheshbon, which is about to unfold in front of us before that, I want to flash a smile at you that you recognize that there's a creative element to this. There's creation. Tshuva, in the language of so many different tzaddikim, in the language of Rav Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin, in the language of Rav Soloveitchik, in the language of Rav Kook, in the language of so many different people, tshuva is a creative act. Tshuva is a creative act. Hashem wore that white talus when he was creating the world, and he wore that white talus when he was teaching us the koach of tshuva. So there's a Torah that I want to share here very quickly from Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Charlat. This is really the only thing that I wanted to share in order to open up the heart a little bit, sharing a little bit from personal experience. But this Torah from Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Charlat, he quotes the machlokas between the Ramban and the Barbanel. In the beginning of the Torah, Bereshis bara Elokim Eis Hashamayim Ve'eis Haaretz, the Ramban explains that we have 3 different words that describe creation. There's the word bara, and we also find that Hashem, in addition to being bara the world, he also was asa, and he was yatzar. Hashem did a number of different pu'ulos in order to create the world. And the Ramban explains that these different names, these different pu'ulos, describe at least 2 different stages, at least in the big sense, of creation. bara, which we're all familiar with this idea, perhaps that Hashem created the world. Bara, yesh me'ayin, followed by creating the world, something from something that was already created. First, there was Bereshis bara Elokim. Hashem created the atomized world, this primordial matter. And then after that, he took this matter and he formed it into the trees and the birds and the fish and humans and all the different parts of creation. And so the Ramban says that there were these two stages of creation. There's the first creation of the stuff creation. That's called bara, yesh me'ayin. And then once there's stuff, Hashem took and created yesh me'yesh from that stuff.
Did you turn the alarm off when you
The
came in?
Dovid'l says,
So it was.
the Dovid'l says, a lashon which is so shocking. The Dovid'l says, Chas v'shalom, lo kain chelek b'Yakov. We don't have such an idea amongst the Jewish people. This is not a Jewish idea. He cries foul on the Rambam. He says, this is, Hashem is Hakol Yachol. And Hashem, with his Ratzon HaPashut, his simple will, decided to create the world. And despite the fact that the Torah describes a process of 7 days, it was all Koach Echad and a Ratzon HaPashut that Hashem wanted to create the world. Hashem created the primordial matter and then had to look in the IKEA booklet to look to see how to put the pieces together. We don't have such an idea amongst the Jewish people. And Rav Yaakov Moshe comes to the defense of the Ramban, or perhaps comes to make shalom between the Ramban and the Dovid'l. And he says that the reason that Hashem created the world in two stages is that Hashem wanted to teach the human being that he's also capable of creating. In other words, the first stage, Hashem created that was Hashem created the world in one shot. But part of the creation, part of what Hashem was giving to the world is Hashem said, I want to be the shituf pu'ula with you. I want to do this together with you. And so in order to do this with you, I'm going to create the possibility that you can now take something and turn it into something else. If not for the fact that Hashem did that second step, the human being wouldn't be able to take a tree and turn it into a chair or a stender. Wouldn't be able to take stone and turn it into the beautiful floors. It's only because Hashem did a second step that he showed that I'm going to create something from something else, which will create in the world the possibility of creating something from something else. And so in this world of tshuva as a creative act, we find in the writings of Tzadok HaKohen Lublin something that takes one step further from the Meimar. Because if it's true, and this is maybe the question that some people are thinking, if it's true that when Hashem created something from something else, he endowed the human being with the ability to do that also. He gave humanity the possibility of donning that same white tallis and saying, we're going to create something now. In the same way that Hashem created the world, and there was a stage of creating yesh me'ayin and yesh me'yesh. And the Meimar of Yaakov Moshe explains that when something was created from something else that was ki'ilu, Hashem was passing over the keys to be able to do that to the human being. Well, doesn't that mean also that in creating the world yesh me'ayin, Hashem, in a certain sense, was giving over the possibility of creating yesh me'ayin? And we know that we can't create yesh me'ayin, so what does it mean? So Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin says that sometimes we hear a baskol. And this idea we find not exactly in this lashon of the creativity, but this lashon we find in the writings of the Meshech Chochmah, we find in the Reishis Chochmah, we find in the Shloah Kadosh. Everywhere we find this idea. That sometimes a person will hear a baskol come from Shemayim, and the baskol will say, Shuvu banim shovim, chutz mi Dovid'l. Chutz mi, enter your name here. You'll hear this baskol that it's finished for you. The story is over for you. You'll hear it from a baskol, something that you can't hear. You'll hear it from a person. You'll hear it from a spouse, chas v'shalom. You'll hear it from a parent. In these little echoes, the way they'll look at you, the way that you'll hear it from somebody on the highway that you accidentally cut off, and they look at you like you're done. You'll hear this echo from all the different places. Maybe you're in the supermarket and you're checking out, and you just feel like I'm finished. And in that moment, says Rav Tzadok, you really are finished. There's a certain psak din. That's the lashon that he uses. If you're willing to accept that from that other person or from yourself, that there's this psak din, Shuvu bonim shovim chutz me'acher. Chutz from you, chutz from that one person. And at that moment, you become kamandalesa. You become like one who isn't anymore. And then from out of somewhere, from out of this place where you aren't, where there's nothing there, all of a sudden, it's possible that there can be a tza'aka, there could be a scream, there could be a wake-up call, that from the depths of a person's heart, they start to scream out that even though I heard the baskol, and even though I was told beferish, that I'm no longer wanted here. Afal Pikin, a person can start over again. They could don that same white talis that Hashem donned when he taught Moshe Rabbeinu the Yud Gimel Midas Rachmim. They could say the Yud Gimel Midas Rachmim again. And in saying the Yud Gimel Midas Rachmim, all of a sudden they create themselves a new Yesh Me'ayin. They also have the koach of Yesh Me'ayin. The koach of Yesh Me'ayin is the koach that we do during the 6 days a week when we're running around with our different businesses. Whatever it is that we're doing, we're creating this from that. But the koach of Yesh Me'ayin is the koach of these days of tshuva. When we again dress ourselves in white, like the master of the universe. And we say we're going to create something out of nothing. Anochi Afar ve'efer, I'm nothing, I'm dust and ashes. I'm dust, which didn't grow anything yet, and I'm ashes, which maybe once was something, but now I'm not. Whatever it is, now I'm starting over from scratch. And Hashem is willing to do that every single year with us over and over again, to start over again, Yesh Me'ayin. To start over Yesh Me'ayin, the biggest mistake that we always make is that we keep falling into these same patterns, these same narratives of this is what I am. And if we would just say, I'm starting over now, Yesh Me'ayin, completely clean slate, then it would be possible. I'm the person who usually doesn't get so into this particular avoda. I'm the person who doesn't normally go to this type of event. I'm the person who doesn't normally get involved in this type of activity. I'm the person who doesn't reach out to somebody else. Whatever the nekuda in your voice Hashem that you're telling yourself, I'm not this, you're not. And that's the opportunity to create a Yesh Me'ayin now. Now is the time that we can create a Yesh Me'ayin. That's the whole avoda of everything that we're trying to do now. We're trying to throw, even if you feel great, even if you don't feel the baskol. I'm not here to tell you the baskol. Everybody here is kulam kedoshim, mum ein bach. But the time now, in these 2 minutes before we start Selichos, is to strip ourselves down to be ayin, to be nothing. And from that place of ayin, from that place of nothingness, from that place of smallness, of going to that nekuda of ayin, then there's the possibility of tapping into Hashem's koach of Yesh Me'ayin He gave to humanity. So I want to end with a Maisa, which is the appropriate way to go into the whole world is a story. Hashem created the world as a story. So if we're going to create the world again, we'll start with a Maisa. This is a Maisa that I heard many years ago from my master and my teacher of Moshe Weinberger about the Baba Sali. We are in, after all, we are in a Sephardic temple here. The Baba Sali used to hold Rosh Chodesh for brains. I don't know if he called them those. He had a Suda on Rosh Chodesh, and it was by invitation only. You had to be invited to the Rosh Chodesh Suda. And I suppose there was some sort of rotation. The person would be invited and not invited. So there was a particular Rosh Chodesh Suda, beautifully set table, Baba Sali's quarters. And there was a particular fellow who got the invite, and he was sitting there watching the Baba Sali. And at some point he got the Azus bug, he ran over to the Baba Sali and he kind of dropped next to him. And he said, Rebbe, my life is just completely in shambles. You can imagine, I don't know the particular details, we could make it up. My wife is sick and I have 6 daughters to marry off and all the stories. And he said to the Baba Sali, I'm in complete, I need a Yeshua big time. The Baba Sali was sitting there thinking. And as the Baba Sali was sitting there thinking, all of a sudden, his son-in-law walked into the room. And the Baba Sali looked up and heard the creak of the door, and he looked up and he saw his son-in-law and he said, this is by invitation only. Who told you Who told you you can come in here? Son-in-law turned like white, like a ghost. And the Baba said, I'm not kidding. He said, I'm serious. Like, who told? This is by invitation only. You weren't given an invitation. So the son-in-law is like shaking. He doesn't know what to say. And Baba Sali smiled, and he looked at him. He said, repeat after me. A son-in-law is like a son, and a son doesn't have to be invited. So the son-in-law, went from being mamish goses to like having a little bit of life, and he somehow managed to get the words out. A son-in-law is like a son, and a son doesn't have to be invited. The Baba said, you tell it to me. A son-in-law is like a son, he doesn't have to be invited. This went back and forth a number of times until finally, the son-in-law screamed. He said, a son-in-law is like a son, and his son doesn't have to be invited. And the Baba Sali dropped on the table. And he started crying. He said, you hear that, Ribbon Shalom? A son doesn't have to be invited. I'm coming up. And the Baba Sali, sitting there in that space with his head on it, came out between his knees, was crying until he made a yeshua for this person. The experience of Selichos that we're entering through right now is the experience of a son-in-law is like a son, kal v'chomer, a son is like a son. A son is like a son, and a Kadosh Baruch Hu, in the same way that I, a basar v'dam, in my katnos, gave a smile to my daughter before I had to put on the mask again when I was going through that medical. Hashem takes off the mask in this 1 second before we begin Selichos. Hashem takes off the mask. And Hashem says, I know you might feel like nothing in some area of your life. Maybe in a lot of areas you feel good. In one area you feel like nothing. And from that place, I want you to know with absolute certainty that from the place of nothingness, you're able to create yourself again, Yeshmai. Hashem should help us.